I never told my son I owned an $80 million fortune from my sister because she asked me to keep it secret. One cold morning, my daughter-in-law arrived at my front door with 2 officers and a lawyer. She said, "You need to sign these papers now because you cannot handle things alone anymore." I stayed calm, looked at the documents, and quietly refused to panic. I knew something was wrong, but I waited to discover why they came that day. Welcome to Dad's Revenge Stories. I'm so grateful you're here. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Also, please note, this story includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and valuable lessons. Any resemblance to names or places is purely coincidental, but the core message remains deeply meaningful. Now, I never told my son I owned an $80 million fortune left to me by my sister on Wall Street. Because the morning my daughter-in-law showed up at my front door with 2 police officers and a lawyer, I finally understood why my sister had made me promise to keep it secret. That morning started the way most of my mornings start. I woke up at 5:45 without an alarm. 38 years of early shifts will do that to a man. And I went to the kitchen to make coffee. I use an old drip machine I bought at a hardware store 14 years ago. It makes good coffee. I have never seen a reason to replace it. I was on my second cup when I heard the knock. It was not a soft knock. It was the kind of knock that carries authority in it, the kind that says whoever is on the other side of that door is not there to borrow sugar. I set my mug on the counter. I walked down the short hallway. I opened the front door of the house I have lived in for 28 years. Diane was standing on my porch. My daughter-in-law was dressed the way she always dressed when she wanted to be taken seriously. Dark blazer hair pulled tight, chin lifted slightly. Beside her stood 2 Sacramento police officers in uniform, hands resting at their sides, faces professionally neutral. To her left was a man I did not recognize, holding a leather briefcase and wearing the expression of someone billing by the hour. Behind all of them, hanging back near the porch steps like a man who wished he were somewhere else entirely, was my son Garrett. I looked at Garrett the way a father looks at a son when he is trying to find something familiar in a face he raised. Garrett was 36 years old. I had driven a city bus through rain and fog and Sacramento Valley heat for nearly 4 decades to give that boy everything I never had. He was wearing a pressed shirt and dark slacks. He would not meet my eyes. His jaw was tight and his shoulders were pulled forward like a man bracing for something he already knows is coming. Across the street, my neighbor Margot Tillman had been watering her rose bushes. She had stopped. She was watching. "Good morning, Dad," Diane said. She called me Dad. She had called me Dad since 2 weeks after she and Garrett got engaged, as though the word were a key she had found and decided to try in every lock. "Diane," I said. I looked at the 2 officers. "Good morning, gentlemen." The taller officer, a man with a steady voice and kind eyes, spoke first. "Good morning, sir. I'm Officer Reyes, Sacramento PD. We received a request for a welfare check on this address. We're just here to make sure everything is all right." A welfare check. Those 2 words landed in my chest like stones dropped into still water. I knew what a welfare check was. I also knew who had requested it. I turned my eyes to Diane. She held my gaze without flinching. "A welfare check," I said. "Yes, sir. Concerns were raised about an elderly resident living alone. It's a standard procedure." Officer Reyes said it evenly without apology. I did not blame him. He was doing his job. He had no idea what was actually happening on my front porch. The man with the briefcase cleared his throat. "Mr. Calloway, my name is Gerald Fitch. I'm representing the interests of your son and his wife in a family matter. We'd like the opportunity to speak with you about some concerns regarding your living situation and your estate arrangements." Estate arrangements. I let that phrase sit in the morning air for a moment. The sun was just coming up over the rooftops on my street. It was cold, the way Sacramento gets cold in December. Not brutal, but sharp, the kind of cold that wakes you up faster than coffee. I looked at Garrett one more time. I wanted him to say something. I wanted him to step forward and put his hand on Diane's arm and say, "This is enough, we're going home." I had been wanting that for months, if I was being honest with myself. I had been watching my son drift away from me degree by degree like a boat that slips its rope so slowly you don't notice until it's already gone. I kept thinking he would come back on his own. He did not step forward. He pressed his lips together and stared at a point somewhere past my left shoulder. That told me everything I needed to know. "Come in," I said. "All of you." I stepped back and held the door open. Officer Reyes and his partner entered first, their boots heavy on my hardwood floor. Gerald Fitch followed, briefcase in hand. Diane walked in like she owned the place, and I had come to understand in the month since she married my son that she very much intended to. Garrett was last. He stepped across the threshold of the house he grew up in, and he still would not look at me. I closed the door behind them. The living room felt smaller than usual with 6 people in it. I had lived alone since my wife Carol passed 18 years ago. I was used to the quiet of this house, the way sound moved through it, the way the morning light came through the east window and fell across the oak floor in a long, pale stripe. Now there were voices and leather shoes and a stranger's briefcase sitting on my coffee table. Officer Reyes asked me a series of questions in a calm, methodical way. Did I know what day it was? Did I have any medical concerns? Was I sleeping and eating regularly? Did I feel safe in my home? I answered each one clearly, directly, without rushing. Yes. No. Yes. I told him the coffee was fresh if he wanted a cup. A faint smile crossed his face. I had kept a secret for almost a year. Standing in my own living room, looking at my son's bent head and my daughter-in-law's carefully arranged expression of concern, I thought about my sister Dorothy. I thought about the last real conversation we had 3 weeks before she died, when she told me to keep the trust quiet no matter what. She had said in her practical Wall Street way, "Ray, money doesn't change people, it reveals them." I had not fully understood what she meant when she said it. Standing in that living room on that cold December morning, I was beginning to understand. To understand what happened that morning, you need to know who I am. Not who Diane thought I was. Not the old man with the worn jacket and the rusted pickup truck. Who I actually am. My name is Raymond Calloway. Most people call me Ray. I drove city buses for the Sacramento Regional Transit District for 38 years. Route 30 mostly. Sometimes Route 82 when they were short on drivers. I started when I was 26 years old, the same year Carol and I bought this house, the same year I thought I had finally figured out what my life was going to look like. The house cost $83,000. We scraped together the down payment from 2 years of double shifts and a small loan from Carol's mother. The kitchen linoleum was cracked and the back porch needed replacing, but Carol stood in the empty living room and said, "Ray, this is ours." She said it the way people say things they have been waiting their whole lives to say. I have never forgotten the sound of her voice in that empty room. Carol died of a stroke when Garrett was 12 years old. She was 41. I remember the doctor coming into the waiting room, and I remember the exact pattern of the floor tiles because I stared at them the whole time he was talking. After that, it was just me and Garrett and the Route 30 bus and whatever I could put together for dinner by 6 o'clock. Garrett was a good kid. Smart, curious, a little too interested in what other boys at school were wearing, but good. He had Carol's eyes and her way of tilting his head when he was thinking something through. I coached his little league team for 3 years, even though I knew nothing about baseball. I showed up to every school play and every parent conference and every single graduation right up through the one at Sacramento State, where he walked across that stage in his cap and gown, and I sat in the bleachers with a disposable camera because I had not yet learned how to use a smartphone. I was proud of him every single day of his life. Dorothy was different from me in almost every way that mattered on the surface. She was 6 years younger, sharper in the way she spoke, relentless in a way that made people either admire her or find her exhausting. She left Sacramento at 22 on a bus ticket she bought herself and ended up at Yale on a scholarship that nobody in our family had ever heard of before she applied for it. She called me from New Haven the night she got in. I remember she was crying, which was unusual for Dorothy, and she said, "Ray, I think I'm going to go far." I said, "Dot, you were always going to go far. I just didn't know the zip code yet." She laughed at that. She had a great laugh. Dorothy ended up on Wall Street, managing director at Goldman Sachs by the time she was 44. She never married. She said she was too impatient for compromise, and knowing Dorothy, I believed her. She lived in the apartment in Manhattan that probably cost more per month than I made in a year. But she called me every Sunday morning without fail. Every single Sunday, for 30 years, my phone rang at 9 o'clock, and it was Dorothy, and we talked about everything and nothing, the Sacramento Kings, her latest project, what Garrett was up to, whether I was eating enough vegetables. She never once talked about money. Not in any real way. She sent Garrett a generous check every birthday and Christmas, enough to make him smile, but not enough to make him expect it. And she never, not once in all those years, made me feel like the gap between her life and mine was something to be ashamed of. That was the thing about Dorothy. She understood something most successful people never learn, that the size of your bank account says nothing about the size of your character. Now my friend Frank DeLuca had driven Route 82 for 31 years before his knees gave out, and he took early retirement. We had been friends since our first week at the depot, when we both showed up 15 minutes early and discovered we were the only two people who thought that was normal. Frank was the kind of man who said exactly what he thought and apologized to nobody for it. His wife Rosemary made the best lasagna in Sacramento, and every few weeks he would show up at my door with a foil-covered pan and no prior warning. I told Frank almost everything. About Garrett growing up, about the loneliness after Carol, about the particular silence of a house where a child used to live. Frank listened the way good men listen, without rushing to fix anything, without offering advice you didn't ask for. There was one thing I noticed about Garrett as he grew up, that I never said out loud, not even to Frank. Garrett had a streak of pride in him that sometimes bent in the wrong direction. He cared about appearances in a way I never fully understood. When he was 15, he was mortified when I picked him up from a school dance in my work uniform because I had come straight from a split shift. He didn't speak to me the whole drive home. I told myself it was teenage embarrassment. I told myself he would grow out of it. Most of him did, but not all of it. When Garrett called to tell me he was getting married, he said, "Dad, she's incredible. She knows exactly what she wants." I thought that sounded like a fine quality in a person. I told him I looked forward to meeting her. I met Diane at a dinner at a restaurant in Midtown Sacramento 3 weeks later. She was polished and quick, and she asked me questions with the focused attention of someone conducting an interview. She smiled at everything I said. Her eyes, I noticed, were rarely still. They moved around the table, around the room, taking inventory in a way that felt automatic, like breathing. Driving home that night in my truck, I thought about what Dorothy had said on the phone 2 weeks before that dinner, near the end of one of our Sunday calls. She had been quieter than usual, and before she hung up, she said, "Ray, promise me something. Don't let anyone make you feel like what you have isn't enough." I had laughed and told her nobody was trying to do that. I thought about that promise all the way home. I did not sleep especially well that night. Dorothy called me on a Tuesday evening in August. I was sitting on the back porch with a glass of iced tea watching the last of the daylight fade over the rooftops. When I saw her name on the screen, I picked up on the first ring. That was our habit. Neither of us let the other's call go to voicemail. "Ray," she said. One word, just my name. But I heard it, the thing underneath it, the weight she was carrying before she even started talking. "What's wrong, Dot?" I said. I set my iced tea down on the porch railing. My hand was already unsteady. She was quiet for 3 full seconds. Dorothy was never quiet. In 30 years of Sunday phone calls, I had never once heard her search for words. "I went to the doctor last week," she said. "And then I went to another doctor. And then a third one, because that's what I do when I don't like an answer." A short breath. "Ray, it's pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The back porch disappeared. The rooftops disappeared. I was sitting in a chair in Sacramento, California, and my little sister had just told me she was dying, and my entire body went cold from the inside out, the way cold works when it has nothing to do with temperature." "How long?" I asked. My voice came out wrong, too flat, too controlled. The voice I used when I needed to hold something together. "They're saying 6 months. Maybe 8 if I respond well to treatment." She paused. "I'm not going to respond well to treatment, Ray. I know my own body." "Dorothy." "Don't," she said, and her voice was firm the way it always got when she had already done her grieving privately and was ready to move forward. "I didn't call to cry with you. I called because I need you to listen. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. "I'm listening." She told me she had been working with her attorney, a woman named Patricia Odom, for the past 11 years. Patricia had handled Dorothy's estate, planning her contracts, her investment structures. Dorothy trusted her completely, which meant something, because Dorothy did not trust easily. "I've set up an irrevocable trust," Dorothy said. "That means once it's established, the terms cannot be changed by anyone. Not by me, not by a family member, not by a court. Unless there's fraud involved. The assets inside the trust transfer directly to the beneficiary without going through probate. No court delays, no public record. Private and clean. Dorothy, I don't need Ray." Her voice dropped. "You are the beneficiary. You are the only beneficiary. I need you to hear that." I pressed my free hand flat against my knee to keep it still. "How much?" she told me. $80 million. Investment portfolios, commercial real estate holdings in 3 states. Liquid assets managed through accounts Patricia oversaw. $80 million that my little sister had built from nothing, from a bus ticket and a scholarship, and 30 years of relentless, focused, brilliant work. I could not speak for a long moment. "Ray," Dorothy said. "Say something." "I don't know what to say, Dot." "Then just listen." She took a slow breath. "I need you to promise me something. Do not tell anyone about this. Not a neighbor. Not Frank. And not Garrett." She stopped. "Especially not Garrett." That landed differently than the rest of it. "Why especially not Garrett?" "Because he's getting married," she said. "And I don't know her." I thought about Diane, about those quick inventory-taking eyes, about the questions that had felt less like curiosity and more like research. "I don't know her either," I said quietly. "Promise me, Ray." "I promise." She died on a Thursday in November. I flew to New York alone. I sat in the front row at a small service in Manhattan, attended by colleagues, former clients, and a handful of people who had known Dorothy the way New York lets you know someone through work and proximity and mutual respect. Garrett called the morning of the service. He said he was sorry that a project deadline had made travel impossible. I told him it was all right. I held the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. It was not all right. In January, Patricia Odom called me. She had a calm, precise voice and the unhurried manner of someone who had delivered important news many times and understood that the right pace mattered. She asked me to come to her office in downtown Sacramento. I drove there in my truck parked on the street and sat in the cab for 4 minutes before I went inside. Patricia's office was quiet and orderly. She shook my hand, offered me coffee, and then opened a folder on the desk between us. She walked me through every element of the trust, what it contained, how it was structured, what my rights were as the sole beneficiary, and what Dorothy's instructions had specified regarding privacy. Dorothy was very clear, Patricia said, folding her hands on the desk. She did not want the existence or the value of this trust disclosed to any third party without your explicit authorization. That includes family members. She told me not to tell my son, I said. Patricia nodded. She anticipated that there might be people in your life whose interest in you could change significantly upon learning about this. She said it carefully, without judgment. I looked down at the documents. $80 million. My sister's entire life's work handed to a man who drove a city bus and owned a drip coffee maker from a hardware store. Did Dorothy say why she chose me? I asked. Patricia allowed herself a small, genuine smile. She said you were the only person in her life who had never once asked her for a single thing. I drove home in silence that afternoon. The truck felt the same as it always had, the familiar rattle of the passenger window, the way the heater took 3 minutes to warm up the particular creak of the seat when I shifted my weight. Nothing about that drive was different, but I was different. I carried something enormous and invisible, and I had promised my sister I would carry it alone. I kept that promise for 11 months. I kept it through Garrett's wedding. I kept it through every question Diane asked and every document she pushed across my kitchen table. I kept it through a December morning when I opened my front door and found police officers on my porch. I kept it because Dorothy had asked me to. And because somewhere in the part of me that had driven strangers safely through Sacramento for 38 years, I understood that some things should be earned before they are given. 4 months after I buried my sister, my son called to tell me he was getting married. I was in the kitchen when he called, washing the breakfast dishes, the way I always do by hand, one at a time, the radio on low. Garrett's voice on the phone was bright and fast, the way it got when he was excited about something and wanted to get the words out before the feeling faded. Dad, I asked Diane to marry me last night. She said yes. A pause. I really want you to like her. I turned off the faucet. I dried my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. Then bring her over, I said. Let me meet her properly. We had dinner at my kitchen table 3 weeks later. Diane Harlow arrived in a charcoal blazer and dark slacks. Her hair pulled back cleanly, a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon in her hand that probably cost more than my weekly grocery bill. She shook my hand with a firm, deliberate grip and looked me directly in the eye. It's so good to finally meet you, Mr. Calloway, she said. Garrett talks about you constantly. I noticed she did not call me Ray. She did not call me Dad. She called me Mr. Calloway, which was either genuine respect or a calculated opening position. I was not yet sure which. I made pot roast. It was the same recipe Carol used, the one Garrett had requested every birthday, until he was old enough to request restaurant dinners instead. Diane ate carefully in small portions and complimented the meal twice in ways that sounded rehearsed. Garrett ate the way he always ate at my table, quickly leaning forward, reaching for the bread without asking. Some habits survive everything. Diane asked me questions throughout dinner. At first they sounded like the ordinary questions a person asks when they are getting to know someone. How long had I driven buses? Did I miss it since retiring? What did I do with my time now? But then the questions shifted almost imperceptibly, like a river that changes direction so gradually you do not notice until you are already somewhere different. Is this the house you've always lived in? She asked, refilling her own wine glass. 28 years, I said. It must be worth quite a bit now. Sacramento real estate has gone crazy. She smiled when she said it, easy and conversational, as though we were discussing the weather. I don't think about it much, I said. Of course, she nodded. Did Garrett mention his father used to drive buses? She said, turning to Garrett. I watched something flicker across my son's face, a tightening around the jaw, brief and gone, a small shame quickly buried. He knows Diane, Garrett said. Of course he does. She laughed lightly and touched Garrett's arm. After dinner, when Diane was in the bathroom, Garrett helped me carry plates to the kitchen. He set them beside the sink and kept his voice low. What do you think? He asked. I looked at my son. He was looking at me with an expression I recognized, the one that meant the answer mattered more than he wanted to let on. She's sharp, I said carefully. Garrett's shoulders relaxed. She really is. She used to work in loan origination at a bank. She understands numbers, investments, all of it. He said it the way people mention credentials, as though he were building a case. I nodded and began rinsing the plates. Loan origination. The phrase settled in my mind and stayed there. The wedding was in April at a venue in East Sacramento with exposed brick walls and string lights and a catering menu I did not recognize a single item on. I wore my best suit, the dark navy one I had bought for Carol's funeral and worn only twice since. I drove myself in the truck. In the parking lot, I saw Garrett watching me pull in. He looked at the truck, then looked away. Frank came with me. He sat beside me during the ceremony in a sports coat he had ironed himself, and when the officiant asked if anyone had objections, Frank leaned over and whispered, I have a few, but I'll hold them. I almost laughed out loud. I needed that. Diane walked down the aisle looking composed and certain, the way people look when they have decided exactly what they want and have arranged events accordingly. Garrett waited at the altar with wet eyes. That part was real. Whatever else was complicated about that day, my son's love for that woman in that moment was genuine, and I held on to that because I needed something to hold on to. At the reception, Diane's mother found me at the bar and introduced herself as Beverly. She had Diane's sharp eyes and a glass of champagne she was already halfway through. Garrett is a wonderful young man, she said. You must be very proud. I am, I said. Diane says you're retired. Beverly smiled. She says you've had a very simple life, a very simple life. I turned that phrase over in my mind for the rest of the evening. I thought about 38 winters on Route 30. I thought about raising a son alone after his mother died. Simple. That was one word for it. Frank drove us home because I had 2 beers and he had switched to club soda after the first hour. We did not talk much on the way back. Sacramento slid past the windows, the streets quiet, the traffic lights cycling through their colors for no one in particular. Ray, Frank said when he pulled up in front of my house. I know, I said. I haven't said anything yet. I know what you're going to say, Frank. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that woman doesn't look at people. She looks at what people own. I got out of the truck. I thanked him for the ride. I went inside, hung my navy suit jacket on the back of the bedroom door, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. Dorothy, I thought, you knew. Even then you already knew. There is a particular kind of conversation that sounds like concern but feels like an audit. Diane was very good at those conversations. It started small. Everything that is designed to move you starts small. 3 weeks after the wedding, she called me on a Sunday afternoon. Not Garrett, Diane herself, to ask whether I had looked into updating my health coverage since Medicare had changed some of its supplemental plan options. She had read an article, she said. She just wanted to make sure I was taken care of. I'm all right, Diane, I told her. I've had the same plan for 6 years. It works fine. Of course, she said warmly. I just worry about you out there alone. Garrett does too. I thanked her. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment with the phone still in my hand, and I thought about the way she had said out there alone, as though my house were a remote outpost and not a neighborhood where I had lived for nearly 3 decades. The calls continued. Once a week, sometimes twice, each one reasonable on its surface. Had I thought about whether my homeowner's insurance was keeping pace with property values? Did I know that some retirement accounts had required minimum distributions after a certain age? And had I spoken with a financial advisor? Was I aware that estate documents often needed to be updated when a family member's situation changed a marriage, for instance? I answered each question simply and without elaboration. Fine. Yes. I'll look into it. The less I gave her, the more carefully she listened, as though my short answers were themselves a kind of information. In May, Garrett and Diane came over for Sunday dinner. It was the first time they had both been to the house since the wedding. Garrett fixed the loose hinge on the back gate while Diane sat at the kitchen table watching me cook. She had a glass of white wine and a pleasant expression, and she asked me in a voice so casual it could have been a question about the weather, whether the house had ever been appraised. Not recently, I said. I kept my eyes on the stove. You should probably know what it's worth, she said. Sacramento values have doubled in some neighborhoods in the past 8 years. You might be sitting on more than you realize. I'm not sitting on anything, I said. I'm cooking chicken. Garrett laughed from somewhere near the back door. Diane smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. After dinner, when Garrett went to use the bathroom, Diane leaned forward across the table. The pleasant expression was still there, but her voice dropped and took on a different quality, direct, stripped of its social coating. Ray, she said, I want you to know that Garrett and I are here for you. Whatever you need. We think about your future a lot. I looked at her. That's kind of you. We want to make sure that when the time comes for anything, you have a plan, that Garrett is in a position to help. She paused. Has anyone ever talked to you about a living trust or a power of attorney, just so things are organized? I set down my fork. Diane, I said, I drove a bus for 38 years. I balanced a budget, raised a son, and kept this house from the time I was 26 years old. I am organized. Her chin lifted slightly. Of course you are. I didn't mean, I know what you meant, I said. The bathroom door opened. Garrett came back in and looked between us. Everything okay? Just talking, Diane said, and her voice was warm again, easy as though a switch had been thrown. That was the night I called Frank and told him what she had asked. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Ray, that woman is not asking you questions. She's drawing a map. I thought about that for 2 weeks. In June, I went to Garrett's house to return a toolbox he had left at my place after fixing the gate. The front door was not fully closed, just resting against the frame the way it does when the latch doesn't catch. I raised my hand to knock. And then I heard Diane's voice from inside, clear and unhurried, the way people talk when they are certain they are not being heard. He's your only father, Garrett. One day everything in that house will belong to you anyway. The property alone is worth a significant amount. Why wouldn't you start thinking ahead? I stood on the front step without moving. The toolbox was heavy in my hand. Garrett's response was low, and I caught only part of it. Something about not wanting to push. Something about giving it time. "Well, giving it time doesn't build anything," Diane said. Her voice was patient and instructional, the voice of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand. "You need to be practical. He's 67. He lives alone. These are facts." I stepped back from the door. I walked back to my truck. I put the toolbox on the passenger seat. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment with both hands on my knees, looking through the windshield at nothing in particular. I did not go back to knock. I did not call Garrett that evening to tell him what I had heard. I drove home through the Sacramento streets in the long, late light of a June evening, and I thought about my son standing in that hallway saying he did not want to push, and I thought about what it meant that he had not said no. There is a difference between a man who is tempted and a man who is complicit. That night I was not yet sure which one my son was, but I was beginning to ask the question. And once a man starts asking that question about his own child, something changes that does not easily change back. I want to tell you about the morning I opened my laptop to check the weather and accidentally saw something I was never meant to see. It was a Tuesday in July. I had been awake since before 6, the way I always am, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee and my laptop looking up whether the heat would break by the weekend. Sacramento summers are serious business. When the valley heats up, it heats up completely, and I had been meaning to check whether the fan in the upstairs bedroom needed replacing. I finished checking the forecast, and then, without quite intending to, I clicked over to Garrett's social media page. I did it the way older people do things on computers, not smoothly, not deliberately, just following one click with another until you end up somewhere you did not plan to be. The page loaded. I looked at it for a long moment. Every photograph of the two of us was gone, not moved, not reorganized. Gone. The birthday where I grilled steaks in the backyard, and Garrett wore the Kings jersey I had saved up for. The fishing trip to Folsom Lake the summer he turned 16, both of us sunburned and holding up fish neither of us was proud of. The afternoon at the depot when he was 8 years old, and I let him sit in the driver's seat of the bus, and he gripped that big steering wheel with both hands and grinned like he had been handed the keys to the world. All of it gone. What remained were photographs of Garrett and Diane at dinner parties, at rooftop events, at what appeared to be a wine tasting in Napa. Garrett in a blazer I had never seen. Garrett laughing at a table full of people I did not recognize. Garrett looking exactly like the version of himself that Diane had decided he should be. I closed the laptop slowly. I sat with my hands flat on the table and my coffee going cold beside me, and I felt something move through my chest that I did not have a clean name for. It was not anger exactly. It was closer to the feeling of reaching for something that should be there and finding empty air. I went to the hallway closet and took down the photo album from the top shelf. It was the old kind, the kind with plastic sleeves and cardboard pages, the kind nobody makes anymore. Carol had put it together when Garrett was small. After she died, I had kept it up, adding pictures every year, sliding them carefully into the sleeves, the way she had taught me, making sure the dates were written on the back in pencil. I carried it to the armchair by the window and sat down and opened it to the first page. Garrett, at 2 years old, asleep on my chest on this same couch. Garrett at 5, missing his 2 front teeth, holding a fish stick up to the camera like a trophy. Garrett at 9, standing in front of the bus in his Halloween costume. He had wanted to be a bus driver that year, and I had found him a little uniform at a thrift store. and he had worn it all day with complete seriousness. I turned pages for a long time. 3 days later, Garrett called me on a Thursday afternoon. He needed a favor, he said. His car was in the shop, and he needed a ride from a work event downtown to the restaurant where he was meeting Diane for dinner. Could I pick him up at 5:30? Of course, I said. I'll be there. I pulled up in front of the office building at 5:28. I was always early. 38 years of scheduled routes had made punctuality something close to a physical reflex. I sat with the engine running and watched Garrett come through the glass doors, with two colleagues, a man and a woman, both of them dressed the way young professionals in Sacramento dress when they want to look like they work in San Francisco. Garrett saw the truck. His stride changed. A small thing barely visible, but I had been watching that boy walk since he took his first steps in this kitchen, and I knew every variation of his gait. He slowed. His chin dropped slightly. He said something to his colleagues, something quick, something that made the woman glance toward my truck with a politely blank expression. Then he crossed the sidewalk and opened the passenger door and got in. "Hey, Dad." His voice was normal, cheerful even. "Hey, son." I pulled out into traffic. We drove 2 blocks before he said it. "Dad, next time, and I know this sounds stupid, but maybe just use a rideshare app. It's easier for everyone." I kept my eyes on the road. "Easier for who, Garrett?" He shifted in his seat. "It's just parking downtown is a nightmare, and the truck is kind of—" He stopped. "Kind of what?" He did not answer. He looked out the passenger window at the Sacramento streets sliding past at the summer light, on the buildings, at everything that was not my face. I dropped him off at the restaurant without another word about it. I watched him walk toward the entrance, straightening his jacket as he went, becoming someone else before he even reached the door. Then I drove home. I called Frank that night. I told him about the photographs and about the truck. Frank listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ray, that boy is ashamed of you. And that is the saddest thing I have heard in a long time, because you are the best man I know." I thanked him. I hung up. I sat in my armchair in the dark, and I thought about a little boy in a thrift store bus driver costume holding a fish stick up like a trophy. Dorothy had once told me something I had not thought about in years. She said, "Ray, the hardest thing about loving people is that you cannot make them worthy of it." I had not understood what she meant when she said it. Sitting in that chair in the quiet of my house, I understood it now. I am not a man who cooks elaborate meals. Most evenings I make something simple, a pork chop, some vegetables, rice from the cooker on the counter that Garrett bought me 3 Christmases ago. But every year, on Dorothy's birthday, the 14th of August, I made the dinner she loved most. Roast chicken with lemon and thyme. Mashed potatoes with real butter, not the kind from a tub. Apple pie from scratch. The crust made the way Carol taught me, with cold butter cut into the flour until it looked like coarse sand. Dorothy had requested this exact meal every time she visited Sacramento, which was not often enough, and I had made it every year on her birthday since she moved to New York, even the years she could not be here to eat it. This year she would never be here again, but I made it anyway. I started at 7 in the morning. I had the chicken in the oven by 9. The kitchen filled up with the smell of roasting meat and lemon zest, and for a little while it felt almost like the old days. Like Dorothy might walk through the back door any minute with her rolling carry-on suitcase and her New York energy and her habit of immediately criticizing whatever I had done with the living room furniture. I set the table for 3. 1 place for me, 1 for Garrett. One that I left empty the way you leave the space for someone who is gone but not forgotten. At 4 in the afternoon, I called Garrett to confirm. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad, still on for tonight?" Dinner's at 6, I said. Chicken's already done. I'm starting the pie now. Great, he said. We'll be there. That meant Diane was coming too. I had set only 3 places. I went and got a 4th plate from the cabinet and added it to the table. Then I started on the pie crust. At 5:15, my phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Garrett. I wiped my hands on the dish towel and picked it up. Dad, something came up with some friends of Diane's. Going to have to take a rain check on tonight. Sorry. I read it twice. I set the phone face down on the counter. The pie was in the oven. The chicken was resting under foil. The mashed potatoes were in the pot, still warm. The table was set for 4 people, 1 of them dead and 3 of them alive. And now the only one coming was me. I stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment, with my hand still on the dish towel. My throat felt tight in a way I did not want to examine too closely. I thought about calling him back. I thought about what I would say. I picked up the phone, looked at his name on the screen, and put it back down. Some things you cannot say to your child without it becoming something neither of you can take back. I was still standing there when I heard the knock at the back door. 3 quick raps, the way Frank always knocked, like he was tapping out a rhythm he had decided on decades ago, and saw no reason to change. I opened the door. Frank stood on the back step in his old Sacramento Kings cap and a flannel shirt, holding a 6-pack of beer by the plastic rings. He looked past me at the table. He looked at the 4-place settings and the empty chair and the covered dishes and the pie cooling on the rack. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You cooked." "It's Dorothy's birthday," I said. Frank nodded slowly. He held up the 6-pack. He said, "You'd better let me in then." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down the way he always sat in my kitchen, without ceremony, without making a production of it, just a man taking a seat at his friend's table like he had done 100 times before. I got 2 glasses from the cabinet. I served the chicken. I cut the pie. We ate without talking much. That was one of the things I had always valued about Frank. He understood that silence between friends is not the same as absence. He was there. That was enough. After a while, he looked at the empty chair across the table. Dorothy's chair. "She would have eaten 2 plates of that chicken," he said. "At least 2, I said. "And then she would have told me the time was uneven." Frank smiled. "She would have been right." Probably. We sat with that for a moment. Outside, the August evening was cooling down the way Sacramento evenings eventually do after the sun finally gives up its hold on the valley. A neighbor's sprinklers came on. A dog barked twice and stopped. Frank picked up his beer and looked at me across the table. "Garrett didn't come," he said. It was not a question. "Something came up," I said. Frank looked at me steadily. He had known me for 31 years. He did not need me to say anything else, and he did not ask me to. He just nodded once slowly and refilled my glass. After Frank left, I washed the dishes alone. I wrapped the leftover chicken in foil. I covered the pie with a clean dish towel. I put the extra plates back in the cabinet one at a time, and I thought about the fact that in 36 years of being Garrett's father, I had never once canceled on him. Not for overtime, not for illness, not for anything. I turned off the kitchen light. I stood in the dark for a moment. This was what being forgotten felt like. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a full table and an empty chair and the sound of your own footsteps in a quiet house. I went to bed at 9:30. I did not sleep for a long time. Diane came to my house alone on a Sunday morning in September. She did not call ahead. She simply pulled into my driveway at 10:15 while I was in the backyard, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants Carol had originally put in, and that I had kept going every summer since, more out of habit than anything else. I heard the car door and came around the side of the house to find her standing on my front porch in a charcoal blazer and leather flats, holding a manila folder against her chest, the way a person holds something they intend to use. "Diane," I said, "Garrett's not here." "I know," she said. "I came to see you." I looked at the folder. I looked at her. "Come in," I said. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink, while she sat down at the table without being asked. I dried my hands, slowly, taking my time, and then I poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her. She did not touch it. "I want to have an honest conversation," she said. "All right," I said. I sat down across from her. "Go ahead." She opened the folder and laid 2 documents on the table between us. She smoothed them flat with her palm, a precise, deliberate gesture. "The first one is a quitclaim deed," she said. "It would transfer the title of this property into a joint ownership arrangement between you and Garrett. The second is a durable power of attorney that would allow Garrett to manage your financial affairs if you become unable to do so." I looked at the documents without touching them. A quitclaim deed in California transfers property ownership directly without any guarantee of title. It is the instrument people use when they want to move a property quickly and quietly without the scrutiny of a standard sale. A durable power of attorney, unlike a regular one, remains in effect even if the person who granted it loses mental capacity. Together, these 2 documents would have given Garrett, and through Garrett Diane, significant control over the most valuable thing I owned and the ability to make financial decisions on my behalf whenever they decided the moment was right. I understood exactly what I was looking at. "Dad," Diane said, and her voice had shifted into its softer register, the one she used when she wanted something. "You're 67 years old. You live alone. If something happened to you, a fall, a health event, anything, Garrett needs to be able to step in quickly. This is just practical planning." "Who drew these up?" I asked. She hesitated. "An attorney." "Which attorney?" Another hesitation. Gerald Fitch. Gerald Fitch. The man with the briefcase who would eventually stand on my porch with 2 police officers. I filed that name away carefully. "Does Garrett know you're here?" I asked. She lifted her chin. "Garrett and I discuss everything together." "That isn't what I asked." Her jaw tightened slightly. "He supports this." I picked up the quitclaim deed and read it through from the beginning, every line, every clause, while Diane sat across the table and watched me. I read slowly and carefully, the way I had learned to read contracts during my years at the Transit Authority, where a single overlooked line in a union agreement could cost a man his benefits. When I finished, I set it down and picked up the power of attorney and read that too. Then I put both documents back on the table and folded my hands. "Diane," I said, "this house has had my name on it since 1996. I have made every mortgage payment, every repair, every property tax installment with money I earned driving a bus before sunrise. It will continue to have my name on it until I decide otherwise, and I have not decided otherwise." She leaned forward. Her voice dropped into something harder. "Don't you want Garrett to feel secure?" "Garrett is 36 years old," I said. "Security comes from what a man builds with his own hands, not from what he inherits before his father is finished living." Her nostrils flared. "You're being unreasonable." "I'm being clear," I said. "There's a difference." She gathered the documents and slid them back into the folder with sharp, precise movements, the way a person handles something they are angry at but cannot afford to damage. She stood up. You're making this harder than it needs to be. You came to my home on a Sunday morning without calling, I said, and asked me to sign over my house and my financial autonomy. I made you coffee. I read every page. I gave you a direct answer. I stood up too. I don't know what part of that is hard. She walked to the front door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back. Garrett is going to be very disappointed. Then Garrett can come tell me that himself, I said. She left. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her car back out of the driveway and disappear down the street. Then I picked up both coffee cups, hers still full untouched, exactly as I had placed it, and poured them both down the sink. I took the notepad from the kitchen drawer and wrote down 2 things. Gerald Fitch. Quitclaim deed durable POA September. I folded the paper and put it in the back of the junk drawer under the batteries and the spare keys where I kept things I might need later. Then I went back out to finish pulling weeds from around Carol's tomato plants. The sun was warm on my back. The neighborhood was quiet. 3 houses down, someone was mowing their lawn, and the sound of it was ordinary and steady and good. I thought about calling Frank. Then I decided not to. Some things you need to carry alone for a while before you hand them to someone else. I worked in the garden until noon. I did not feel afraid. I felt something colder and more useful than fear. I felt certain. My son called me on a Thursday afternoon in October, with the kind of voice people use when they have rehearsed what they are going to say. I recognized it immediately. Garrett had used that voice as a teenager when he wanted something he already knew. I might not agree to a camping trip with boys I had never met in advance on his allowance for shoes that cost more than my weekly groceries. The voice was casual on the surface and careful underneath, like a man walking across ice and pretending he is walking on solid ground. "Dad," he said, "I've been thinking about something and I wanted to run it by you." "Go ahead," I said. You know my friend Tyler Marsh. We went to Sacramento State together. He's been doing real estate investment deals for the past few years, buying distressed properties, renovating them, selling them on. He's put together a group of investors for a new project, commercial property over in Elk Grove. He paused. "It's a solid opportunity, Dad. Tyler's done this 3 times already. The returns have been significant." I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper I still had delivered every morning because I liked the weight of it in my hands. I set the paper down. "How much?" I asked. $200,000, Garrett said. "As a starting position, there's potential to increase the stake later if the first phase goes well. $200,000 from a man whose father drove a city bus." I kept my voice level. "Tell me about the risk. It's real estate, Dad. Tangible asset. You can see it, touch it." "That isn't what I asked. Tell me about the risk." A short pause. "Tyler's group has done their due diligence. They have a contractor lined up, a buyer already interested in the finished property." "Garrett," I said, "I've been alive for 67 years. I know what due diligence sounds like when someone actually has it, and I know what it sounds like when someone is using the phrase instead of having it. Which one is this?" The line was quiet for a moment. "Dad, I thought you'd want to help me build something." That sentence landed differently than he intended it to. Help me build something. As though 38 years of double shifts and brown bag lunches and every dollar I had scraped together for his education had not already been exactly that. "Garrett," I said, "I didn't drive a bus for 38 years to hand $200,000 to someone I have never met for a deal I cannot verify. If Tyler Marsh has a solid investment, Tyler Marsh can find his own investors." Garrett's voice changed. The careful casualness dropped away, and something harder came through underneath it. "You never support anything I try to do," he said. "You just sit in that house and hold on to everything like it's going to disappear if you let go of it for 1 second. I support things that make sense," I said. "This makes sense. You just won't see it because it came from me. Tim, if it came from you, you would have the paperwork ready and the numbers in front of you when you called. You don't have either of those things." He hung up before I finished the sentence. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. Then I set it on the table and picked up my newspaper and tried to read, but the words would not arrange themselves into meaning. I put the paper down again. I drank my coffee. It had gone cold. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, I drove to the hardware store on Stockton Boulevard for weather stripping for the back door. I was gone for 45 minutes. When I came back, I let myself in through the front, set the bag on the hallway table, and walked toward the kitchen. The door to my office was open. It was always closed. I stepped into the doorway and looked. The file drawer of my desk was not fully shut. The edge of a folder was visible, caught slightly in the gap, which meant the drawer had been opened and closed in a hurry. The stack of papers on the left side of the desk was marginally different from how I had left it. I had spent 38 years keeping logs and route sheets and maintenance records with the particular precision that comes from professional habit, and I knew exactly where everything on that desk belonged. Someone had been through my files. I did not touch anything. I stood in the doorway and looked at the room for a long moment. Then I walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on and thought about who had a key to my house. Garrett had a key. He had held a spare since his college years. I had never asked for it back because it had never occurred to me that I might need to. What Diane would have found in that file drawer was a pension statement, showing monthly deposits of $1,200, a homeowner's insurance policy, a folder of utility bills, and the title to the truck. There was nothing else. Everything connected to Patricia Odom, and the trust existed in a separate, secure location that had never been anywhere near this house. I thought about Diane going through those files. I thought about her finding nothing except the evidence of a modest retirement. I thought about what conclusion she would draw from that, and what she might do next. I went to the bottom drawer of my desk, the one I had not opened in months, and I took out the envelope Dorothy had sent me 3 weeks before she died. A personal letter separate from the trust documents. I had not opened it. I had told myself I was not ready. I held it in both hands and looked at her handwriting on the front. Ray. Just my name in her strong, slanted script. I put it back in the drawer without opening it. I was not ready yet. But I was getting closer. I called Frank that evening. I told him about the files. Frank exhaled slowly. "Ray," he said, you need to understand something. These people are not going to stop." "I know," I said. "So what are you going to do?" I looked at the bottom drawer of my desk. "I'm going to let them think they already have," I said. "There is a specific kind of cruelty in being made to feel like a stranger in your own home." I did not expect to learn what that felt like at 67 years old. But life has a way of teaching you things you never signed up to learn. It started reasonably enough. 2 weeks after Garrett hung up on me, he called back. His voice was different this time, quieter, without the hard edge from our last conversation. He said he and Diane had been talking, and they were worried about me being alone as the weather turned cold. He asked whether it would be all right if they stayed at the house for a few weeks. Just to be nearby. Just in case. I thought about it for a moment. I thought about the laughter I had heard in Garrett's voice when he was 8 years old, sitting in the driver's seat of my bus with both hands on the wheel. I thought about the fact that whatever Diane had become in my life, Garrett was still my son. "All right," I said. "You can stay in the guest room." They moved in on a Saturday, with 2 carloads of bags and boxes. More than a few weeks' worth, I noticed, but I did not say anything. I made up the guest room with clean sheets and put extra towels in the bathroom, and told myself this could still be salvaged, that people could still surprise you, that a father's instinct to believe in his child was not always a weakness. For the first few days it was manageable. Diane cooked dinner twice, which I will admit was not bad, and Garrett fixed the loose board on the front porch that I had been meaning to get to for months. In the evenings, we sat in the living room and the television was on, and it almost felt like something normal. Then I noticed the small things beginning to change. My coffee was moved from the left side of the counter to the right, where I had never kept it. The chair I always sat in at the kitchen table, the one facing the window, the one Carol used to say gave me my best thinking light, had been replaced by a different chair from the dining set without explanation. Small things. The kind of things that could be accidents. The kind of things that are never accidents. On a Tuesday morning, I came back from my walk at 8:30 and went to my office to get the photo album. I kept it on the second shelf of the bookcase between a dictionary and a collection of road maps I had accumulated over 38 years of driving. I went to the shelf. The album was not there. I checked the other shelves. I checked the drawer of my desk. I stood in the middle of my office and looked around the room, and that was when I saw it. The door had a new lock. A small silver deadbolt fitted neatly into the wood just above the original handle with no key in sight. I stood in the hallway outside my office door, and I put my hand on the new lock, and I felt the cold metal under my fingers, and I breathed through my nose slowly and carefully, the way I had learned to breathe in situations where what I wanted to do and what I should do were very different things. I found Diane in the kitchen making coffee. She was wearing one of Garrett's sweatshirts and scrolling through her phone, and she looked up when I came in with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific conversation and has already prepared for it. "There is a new lock on my office door," I said. "Oh." She set her phone down. "Yes, we thought it would be better to secure the important documents in there. You know, with more people in the house." She smiled the way people smile when they are explaining something they know you will not like. "I have the key. I'll get it to you." I looked at her for a long moment. "Diane," I said, "that is my office, in my house. I would like the key now." "Of course." She turned back to the coffee maker. "Let me find it later. I think it's in my bag." "Now," I said. Something moved across her face, not anger, calculation. She opened her purse on this counter and made a show of looking through it. "I don't seem to have it on me. I'll find it this afternoon, I promise." She did not find it that afternoon. She did not find it the next morning either. At 10 o'clock, I called a locksmith from the Yellow Pages, the actual physical Yellow Pages, because I had kept the book, and because sometimes the old ways are the most satisfying. And by noon, a man named Gary had fitted a new lock on my office door and handed me 2 keys, both of which I put in my shirt pocket. When Diane came home at 2 and tried the office door and found it locked with a key she did not have, she came to find me in the backyard. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were sharp. "You changed the lock." "I did," I said. I was deadheading the roses along the back fence. I did not stop working. "That seems unnecessary." "It was my door," I said. "In my house. I needed a key to it. Now I have one." She stood there for a moment, and I could feel her deciding something. Then she went back inside without another word. I called Frank that evening. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Ray, when are you going to tell me what you're actually planning?" "Soon," I said. "How soon?" I looked at my office door, both keys hanging on the hook I had just put up inside the frame. "Something is coming, Frank," I said. "When it does, I need you to know I am ready for it." He exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "I'm here." I hung up and sat in my armchair in the clean, quiet dark of my living room. Garrett was not home yet. Diane was somewhere in the back of the house, and I sat in my own chair in my own house with the keys to my own door in my pocket, and I thought, this is still mine. Every inch of it. And I intend to keep it that way. I fell on a Wednesday morning in the third week of November. Garrett and Diane had left early. I heard their car back out of the driveway at 7:15, and I was alone in the house the way I preferred to be in the mornings with my coffee and the quiet, and no one rearranging anything while I was not looking. The back steps were wet. We had rain the night before, the kind of steady November rain that Sacramento gets when the valley finally remembers it has a winter, and I had not thought to check the steps before I went out to get the newspaper from the back porch, where the carrier sometimes left it when the front box was full. My left foot went out from under me on the second step. I went down hard and fast the way falls happen when you are not young enough to catch yourself, and I hit the wooden decking with my lower back and the base of my right palm. And I lay there for a moment, looking up at the gray Sacramento sky and taking inventory of what hurt and how much. My back hurt considerably. My hand was scraped and bleeding in a minor way. My pride hurt in the particular fashion that is reserved for men who have spent decades believing they are more capable than their age suggests. I got myself up, slowly holding the railing with both hands, and I went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table. The pain in my lower back was sharp when I moved and duller when I stayed still. I knew from the way it felt that it was muscular, not a fracture, not a disc, but the kind of deep tissue injury that announces itself loudly for several days and then fades to a manageable ache. I had driven through worse, but I was not driving anywhere that morning. I picked up my phone and called Garrett. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His voice on the recording was professional and clipped the voice he used for work, not the voice he used with me. I waited for the beep. "Garrett, it's Dad. I took a fall on the back steps. I'm okay, but my back is hurting, and I think I should get it looked at. Can you call me back?" I hung up. I waited 10 minutes. He did not call back. I called again. 3 rings this time, then voicemail. I did not leave another message. I called a 3rd time. Voicemail on the 2nd ring, which meant he had seen my name on the screen and declined the call manually. I set the phone down on the table and looked at it for a moment. My back was tightening up the way muscles do when they have been insulted and are making sure you know about it. I breathed carefully and reached for my phone again and called 911. And I told the dispatcher my address and that I had fallen and had significant back pain and needed assistance. She was calm and efficient and told me someone would be there in 8 minutes. They were there in 6. 2 paramedics, a man and a woman, both of them younger than Garrett, both of them moving with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this many times and understand that the best thing you can do for a person in pain is to be competent and unhurried at the same time. They checked my back, my blood pressure, my responses. They recommended I come in for imaging to rule out anything structural. I went with them. The emergency room at UC Davis Medical Center was busy in the particular way that hospital emergency rooms are busy on weekday mornings, not chaotic, just continuously occupied, one situation following another with the quiet persistence of water finding its level. I was there for 3 hours. The imaging showed no fracture, no disc involvement. Severe muscle strain, the doctor told me, with some bruising developing along the lower lumbar. Rest, ice, anti-inflammatories. Nothing heroic. Nothing permanent. I sat on the paper-covered examination table, and I took out my phone. There was a text from Garrett. It had come in 40 minutes after my third call. Dad, I'm in a meeting. Everything okay? 5 words. I had called my son 3 times from a position of genuine pain, and the first 40 minutes had produced 5 words and a question mark. I looked at that message for a long time. I thought about a morning when Garrett was 9 years old and had fallen off his bicycle on the street in front of our house. I had been in the backyard and heard him cry out, and I was over the fence and kneeling beside him on the asphalt before I had fully registered what I was doing. I had carried him inside. I had cleaned the gravel out of his knee with the tweezers and hydrogen peroxide while he gritted his teeth and tried not to cry, and when it was over, he had leaned his head against my shoulder and said, "Thanks, Dad," in a small voice, and I had held him there for a moment longer than was necessary, because he was my son, and he was hurt, and that was enough reason. I put my phone in my jacket pocket without answering his message. Frank arrived at the hospital at noon. I had called him from the examination table after I read Garrett's text, and he had said, "Which hospital?" without asking any other questions, which was exactly what I needed from him at that moment. He came through the emergency room doors in his king's cap and his flannel shirt, and he walked straight to where I was sitting in the discharge area and handed me a bottle of water without saying anything. "Thank you," I said. "Don't mention it." He sat down beside me. "How bad?" "Muscle strain. I'll be sore for a week." He nodded. "Did Garrett come?" I handed him my phone. He read the text. He handed it back. He did not say anything about it, and I was grateful for that, because there was nothing to say that the 5 words had not already said more clearly than either of us could manage. Frank drove me home in his car. We did not talk much on the way. When he pulled up in front of the house, he put the car in park and sat for a moment with his hands still on the wheel. "Ray," he said. "I know," I said. "Tomorrow is going to be different." I opened the car door and stepped out carefully, one hand on the roof for balance. The afternoon light was thin and gray. The house looked exactly as it always looked. My house. My front steps still wet at the edges where the shadow kept them cold. "Yes," I said. "It is. I want to go back to that morning now, the morning I told you about at the very beginning of this story. Because now that you know everything that came before it, I think you will understand it differently." It was a Tuesday in December, 11 days after Frank drove me home from the hospital. My back was still sore in the particular way that reminds you of its presence every time you stand up or sit down or reach for something above your head, but I was moving well enough. Garrett and Diane were still in the guest room. We had spoken very little in those 11 days. Diane had asked once how my back was feeling in a voice that was more procedural than concerned, and I had said, "Fine, thank you," and that had been the extent of it. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee at 7:40 when I heard the car doors. More than one. I looked out the kitchen window and saw an unfamiliar sedan parked at the curb behind Diane's car. Then I heard the footsteps on the front porch. Then the knock. I set my coffee down. I walked down the hallway. I opened the door. Diane stood on my porch in her charcoal blazer, the one she always wore when she wanted to project authority. Beside her stood Officer Reyes and a younger officer whose nameplate read Dominguez. Behind them, slightly to the left, stood Gerald Fitch with his leather briefcase and his billable hours. And behind all of them, his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes directed at a point somewhere near my left shoulder, stood my son Garrett. Across the street, Margot Tillman had come out to water her roses. She was holding her garden hose and not watering anything. She was watching. "Good morning, Dad," Diane said. I looked at Officer Reyes. He met my eyes with a steady, professional expression that told me he was a decent man doing a job he had been called to do. and was not entirely comfortable with the circumstances. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway," he said. "We received a request for a welfare check at this address. We just want to make sure everything is all right." "Everything is fine," I said. "But come in." I stepped back and held the door, and they filed into my living room, all 5 of them, filling up the space the way people do when they arrive with an agenda. Fitch set his briefcase on my coffee table without asking. Diane stood near the window with her arms at her sides and her chin lifted. Officer Dominguez positioned himself near the hallway entrance, young and quiet, and clearly uncertain about what exactly he had been brought into. I looked at Garrett. He was standing nearest the door, which I understood was not an accident. He was closest to the exit. His jaw was working slightly the way it did when he was grinding his back teeth, a habit he had developed in high school during exam periods and never fully lost. He felt me looking at him, and his eyes moved to mine for exactly 2 seconds before they went back to the middle distance. 2 seconds. That was what 36 years was worth that morning. Officer Reyes walked me through the standard welfare check questions with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this many times. Did I know the date and where I was? Did I have any medical concerns I needed help with? Was I eating and sleeping adequately? Did I feel safe in my home? I answered each question directly and without rushing. December 10th. My home in Sacramento. My back was healing from a muscle strain. Yes, and yes. And then I looked at Officer Reyes and I said, "Officer, I am 67 years old. I drove a city bus for 38 years without missing a shift. I balanced a household budget and raised a child alone for most of his life. I read every document placed in front of me before I sign it, and I have not signed anything I did not intend to sign. Is there anything else you need from me?" Officer Reyes looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at Diane. Then he looked at Fitch, who was opening his briefcase with the deliberate movements of a man about to make a presentation. Reyes held up one hand toward Fitch without looking at him. Fitch stopped. "Mr. Calloway," Reyes said quietly, "everything appears to be in order here." Fitch cleared his throat. "Officer, there are documents we'd like Mr. Calloway to review." "That's a civil matter, sir," Reyes said. "That's not what we're here for." Diane's expression shifted. Something tightened around her eyes that she did not quite manage to control. She turned to Garrett. "Garrett," she said with a particular emphasis that meant she wanted him to say something. Garrett's throat moved. He looked at me, and in that moment I saw something cross his face that I had not seen there since he was a small boy, a flash of something raw and ashamed, something that lived underneath all the other things he had become in the past year. It was there for less than a second. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful blankness he had been wearing for months. He said nothing. I held his gaze and I did not look away. And I did not speak either, because some things need to be said by the person who caused them, not by the person who absorbed them. Officer Reyes turned to me one final time. "Mr. Calloway, is there anything you need from us today?" I thought about it genuinely for a moment. "No," I said. "I think you've done what you came to do." He nodded. He said something quietly to Dominguez. The 2 officers moved toward the door. Reyes paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at me with an expression that was not quite an apology, but was as close to one as his uniform allowed. "Take care of yourself, sir," he said. "I always have," I said. The door closed behind them. 5 people became 3. The living room felt different without the uniforms in it, smaller, closer, the air thicker with everything that had not been said. Fitch reached for his briefcase. Diane drew a breath to speak. I walked to the kitchen and picked up my phone and dialed Patricia Odom. Diane spoke first. She always spoke first. "Dad," she said, coming around the kitchen doorway while I still had the phone in my hand. "I think we need to talk about what just happened." I held up one finger. Patricia's line was ringing. She answered on the second ring the way she always did, with the calm and unhurried manner of a woman who understood that the people who called her were rarely calling with good news. "Patricia," I said. "It's Ray Calloway. I think it's time." A brief pause. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," she said. 9 o'clock. "Thank you." I hung up and set the phone on the counter and turned around. Diane was standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and her chin lifted, and her expression arranged into something that was trying to be reasonable and not quite managing it. Behind her in the living room, Garrett stood near the couch. He had not sat down. Gerald Fitch had closed his briefcase and was waiting near the front door with the particular stillness of a man who bills by the hour and has decided the most profitable thing he can do right now is nothing. "Tell Fitch to leave," I said. Diane's eyes flickered. "Gerald is here to help facilitate. This is my home," I said. "Tell him to leave or I will." She turned and looked at Fitch and gave him a small nod. He picked up his briefcase and let himself out the front door without a word. I heard it close behind him. "Now," I said. "You wanted to talk." Diane uncrossed her arms. She took a breath and shifted into the voice she used when she wanted to sound measured and adult and in control of a situation that was sliding away from her. "Dad, everything we have done has been out of concern for you. You live alone. You had a fall. You are 67 years old and you don't have Diane." My voice was quiet. She stopped. "I am going to ask you one question. I want you to think carefully before you answer it." She waited. Which family," I said, "sends police officers to their father's door to pressure him into signing legal documents, and which family only comes together when there is something to divide?" The kitchen was very still. I could hear the refrigerator running. I could hear a car passing outside. I could hear Garrett breathing from somewhere behind Diane's shoulder. Her mouth opened. She began, "That is not what we were—" "You called a welfare check," I said. "You brought Gerald Fitch and his briefcase to my home at 7:40 in the morning. You have been in this house for 6 weeks, replacing my furniture and locking my doors and going through my files while I was buying groceries." I looked past her at Garrett. "And you stood behind your wife this morning, and you could not find a single word." Garrett's jaw tightened. His hands came out of his pockets. "Dad, it's more complicated than—" "Is it?" I said. "Tell me what part is complicated. Tell me which part I am not understanding." "You won't talk to us," Garrett said, and his voice was rising now, the careful blankness cracking at the edges. "You won't tell us anything. You won't let us help. You sit in this house, and you act like everything is fine, and we don't know what you have, we don't know what your plan is. We don't know anything because you won't let us in." "I let you into my home," I said. "You changed my locks." His face flushed. "That is not the point." "Then tell me the point, Garrett." He stepped forward past Diane, and his voice dropped, and something genuine came through in it. Something I had not heard from him in months. Something raw and young and slightly desperate. "Fine. You want the truth. I want to know what you actually have. I want to know if there is anything here, anything at all, because you live like there isn't, and I need to know what we are dealing with. What you are dealing with." He spread his hands. Is that so wrong to want to know what my own father has? I looked at my son for a long moment. His chest was rising and falling quickly. His eyes were wet at the corners, which I had not expected. And for one brief second, I felt the old reflex, the father's reflex, the one that wants to close the distance and put a hand on the shoulder and say, "It is all right. We will figure this out." I did not move. "Garrett," I said, "I am your father. I have been your father every day of your life. I was your father when I worked double shifts, so you could have the things I never had. I was your father when your mother died, and you were 12 years old, and the two of us had to figure out how to live in this house without her. I was your father when you graduated, and when you got your first job, and when you called me from the parking lot of your office one Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago because you were nervous about a presentation and you needed to hear someone tell you that you were capable." I stopped. I was your father all of those times, not your bank account. Your father. Garrett's throat moved. His eyes were bright, and he was pressing his lips together hard. "The question," I said, "is not what I have. The question is what you lost. And I think you already know the answer." The room held that for a long moment. Diane put her hand on Garrett's arm. He shrugged it off, a small movement, almost involuntary, but I saw it. So did she. I walked past both of them to the front window and looked out at the street. Margot's garden hose was coiled on her porch. The sedan that had brought the officers was gone. The street was ordinary and quiet, and exactly as it had always been. "Patricia Odom is coming tomorrow morning at 9, I said without turning around. "I think you should both be here. Before I reveal what happened, the moment those legal documents were unsealed on my table, if you're listening to Dad's Revenge Stories, drop a 94 in the comments below. So I know you're still with me. A quick reminder, the upcoming chapter includes dramatized story elements. If that's not what you're looking for, feel free to stop the video right here." Patricia Odom drove up in a dark blue sedan at 8:59. I was watching from the kitchen window with my coffee, and I saw her pull to the curb with the precise, unhurried movements of a woman who had never been late to anything in her professional life, and did not intend to start now. She sat in the car for exactly 1 minute. Then she got out, retrieved a leather document case from the back seat, and walked to my front door with the measured stride of someone who understood that the pace at which you enter a room tells people something important about you before you say a single word. I opened the door before she knocked. "Good morning, Ray," she said. "Good morning, Patricia. Thank you for coming." She stepped inside and looked around the living room with the calm, assessing eyes of a woman who had spent 3 decades reading situations before she read documents. Garrett and Diane were already there. Garrett was sitting on the couch with his elbows on his knees. Diane stood near the window in a different blazer from yesterday, which told me she had been home and come back, which told me she had decided to stay in this fight. Patricia set her document case on the coffee table. She shook my hand. She did not introduce herself to Garrett or Diane. She looked at me and said, "Should I proceed?" "Please," I said. She opened the case and removed a bound set of documents, perhaps 40 pages, with tabs along the right edge. She placed it on the coffee table with the cover facing up. Then she sat down in the armchair across from the couch, my armchair, the one I had indicated to her, with a small gesture, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at Garrett and Diane with an expression of complete professional neutrality. "My name is Patricia Odom," she said. "I am an estate attorney based in Sacramento. I have represented the estate of Dorothy Calloway Reed for the past 11 years. I am here today at the request of Raymond Calloway, who is the sole beneficiary of Ms. Calloway Reed's irrevocable trust established in September of last year and executed following her passing in November. Diane's eyes went to the documents on the coffee table. Garrett had not moved. Patricia continued. An irrevocable trust, for those unfamiliar with the instrument, is a legal structure in which assets are transferred out of the grantor's personal estate into a trust that cannot be modified, amended, or revoked after it is created. The assets held within the trust do not pass through probate. They transfer directly and privately to the named beneficiary. The beneficiary in this case is Raymond Calloway, solely and exclusively. The room was very quiet. I would like to summarize the assets held within the trust, Patricia said. She opened the bound document to a tabbed section and read in the same unhurried voice she had used for everything else. An investment portfolio managed through 2 brokerage accounts. Commercial real estate holdings in California, Nevada, and Arizona. Liquid assets held in trust accounts under Patricia's administration. A life insurance policy that had converted to a trust asset upon Dorothy's death. Diane made a sound. It was small and involuntary, and she covered it immediately, pressing her lips together, but it had already happened, and we had all heard it. Her face had gone a color that was not quite white and not quite gray, but somewhere between the two, the color of a person whose internal calculations have just been overturned completely. Garrett had not moved. He was still sitting with his elbows on his knees, but his hands had come up and were pressed flat against his mouth. And he was staring at the document case on the coffee table, as though it had said something to him personally. Patricia closed the document and set it on the table. Mr. Calloway has asked me to make this information available to all parties present. He has also asked me to confirm that under California law, assets held within an irrevocable trust established prior to a marriage are not considered community property and are not subject to claims by a spouse or a spouse's family members. She paused. Are there any questions about what I have just outlined? Diane moved first. She took 2 steps forward from the window, and her voice came out differently than I had heard it before. Higher, thinner, stripped of its careful professional coating. $80 million, she said. It was not quite a question. That is correct, Patricia said. Diane turned to me. Her eyes were moving in a way I recognized, rapidly recalculating the way those eyes had moved at our very first dinner when she was taking inventory of my kitchen and my furniture and everything I owned. Only now the numbers were different, and the calculation was running too fast for her to hide it. Dad, she said, and her voice shifted into something softer, something that reached for warmth the way a person reaches for a railing on dark stairs. I had no idea. I want you to know that nothing we did was meant to. We were just worried about you. We love you. Everything was for the family. I looked at her. I waited until she had finished. Diane, I said, are you sorry for what you did to me, or are you sorry because you just found out I have $80 million? The room held that question like a held breath. Diane opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time since I had known her, Diane Harlow Calloway had nothing ready to say. I turned to look at Garrett. He had not looked up from the coffee table. His hands were still pressed against his mouth, and his shoulders were curved forward, and he was very still, the way a person goes still when something internal has shifted, and they are not yet sure what the new configuration looks like. A knock at the front door broke the silence. 3 quick raps. I knew that knock. I went to the door and opened it. Margot Tillman stood on my porch in her garden jacket, holding a small plate covered with a dish towel. Her eyes moved past me for just a moment, taking in the room behind me, and then they came back to my face with the simple, uncomplicated concern of a neighbor who has known you for 20 years. Shadrisate, she said, I made cornbread. I thought you might need something this morning. I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not known was tight. "Come in, Margot," I said. "I'll put the coffee on." I put the kettle on and got a fourth cup down from the cabinet. Margot set her cornbread on the counter and pulled off the dish towel and looked around my kitchen with the comfortable familiarity of a woman who had stood in this room many times over 20 years, of neighborly borrowing and returning a cup of sugar. Here a screwdriver, there the particular easy commerce of people who have lived beside each other long enough to stop keeping score. She did not look at Diane or Garrett directly, but I saw her take them in the way she took in everything quietly, completely filing it away behind those steady brown eyes. Patricia was packing her document case at the coffee table. She worked with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything, each folder returning to its exact place, the zipper drawn closed with a single smooth motion. She stood and looked at me. "I'll be in touch this week about next steps," she said. Thank you, Patricia." She nodded once. She picked up her case. She walked to the front door, and as she passed Diane, she did not slow down or speed up or change her expression in any way. The door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click. The kitchen held 4 people now: me, Margot, Garrett, and Diane. I poured the hot water and set Margot's cup in front of her at the table, and she wrapped both hands around it and sat quietly, which was one of the things I had always valued about Margot Tillman. She understood when a room needed a witness more than it needed a participant. Diane was still standing near the window. She had recovered something of her composure, the color had come back into her face, and her chin was up again. But there was a quality to her stillness that I had not seen before. She was recalculating. I could practically hear it. Then she crossed the room toward me. Her eyes were wet, which surprised me because I had not thought Diane capable of tears that were not strategic. Her voice when she spoke was lower than usual and slightly unsteady. "Dad," she said, "I need you to hear me. I am sorry. I am genuinely deeply sorry for everything. The documents, the welfare check, all of it." She stopped in front of me. I was afraid. I was afraid for Garrett's future, and I handled it badly, and I know that. But everything I did because I love him. I love this family. Her voice cracked on the last word. "Please." I looked at her for a long moment. She was close enough that I could see the effort it was costing her, the slight trembling of her lower lip, the way her hands had come together in front of her fingers, interlaced. And I thought about every Sunday morning phone call I had not received. Every chair moved without asking. Every lock changed without a key. Every document pushed across my table. Every morning she had stood on my porch with the expression of someone who had already decided what was theirs. "Diane," I said. She looked at me with wet eyes and something that might have been hope. "Are you sorry for what you did to me?" I said. "Or are you sorry because you just found out I have $80 million? The hope went out of her face the way a light goes out, not gradually, all at once. Her lips pressed together. Her hands tightened against each other. Behind her, Margot took a quiet sip of her coffee and looked out the kitchen window at her own garden across the street. Garrett stepped forward from the doorway where he had been standing. His voice was rough, and he cleared it once before speaking. "Diane." He said her name and nothing else, but the way he said it carried something I had not heard from him in a long time. A line. A limit. Something that had been reached. Diane turned to him. He was looking at her with an expression I could not fully read. Not anger, not coldness. Something more complicated. Something that looked like a man seeing a reflection he did not want to spend the rest of his life looking at. "We should go," he said. "Garrett." "We should go," he said again, quietly. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at me. Then she picked up her purse from the counter, and walked to the front door and opened it and went out without speaking again. I heard her heels on the porch steps. I heard the car door. Garrett stood in my kitchen for a moment. He looked at Margot, who looked back at him with the kind of calm, unsentimental steadiness that older women have when they have seen enough of life to know that most crises are neither the first nor the last of their kind. He looked at his hands. He looked at me. "Dad," he said. "Not today, Garrett," I said. Not unkindly, but clearly. He nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when he knows he has no right to push. He walked to the front door. He stopped with his hand on the frame, his back to me, and he stood there for a moment, the way people stand when they want to say something and cannot find the shape of it. Then he went out. The door closed. Margot and I sat at my kitchen table. She cut the cornbread into squares the way she always did, clean and even, and put a square on a napkin in front of me. Outside, I heard a car start. I heard it pull away. "Good cornbread," I said after a while. "Carol's recipe," Margot said. "She gave it to me years ago." "I hope that's all right." I looked down at the cornbread on the napkin. I thought about Carol in this kitchen measuring flour, the radio on low. I thought about all the years this house had held, and all the years it still would. "That's more than all right," I said. We sat together in the quiet of my kitchen for a long time. The morning light came through the east window and fell across the oak floor in a long, pale stripe exactly as it always had. Margot left at 11:30. She washed her own cup at the sink before she went the way she always did, and she squeezed my hand once at the door without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing to do. I watched her cross the street to her own house, and then I closed the door and stood in the quiet of my living room for a long moment. The house felt different with everyone gone. Not empty, I had lived alone in this house for years and knew the particular texture of its silence, the way it settled around you like something familiar and worn. This was different. This was the silence that comes after something has ended, when the air still holds the shape of what was in it. I went to my office. I unlocked the door with the key from my shirt pocket. I sat down at my desk, and I opened the bottom drawer and took out the envelope that had been sitting there for 14 months. Dorothy's handwriting on the front. Ray. Just my name in the strong, slightly slanted script she had used since she was 12 years old, and had decided that her handwriting was going to be distinctive whether her teachers liked it or not. I turned the envelope over in my hands. The seal was intact. Cream-colored paper, the kind Dorothy had always used for personal correspondence. She had bought it by the box from a stationery shop in Manhattan that she had gone to for 30 years. I had been afraid to open it. Not because I thought it would contain something difficult, but because opening it would mean accepting that it was the last thing. The last words she had put down for me. Once I read them, there would be no more. I opened it. The letter was 2 pages handwritten on both sides of a single folded sheet. Her handwriting was slightly less precise than usual. She had written it when she was already ill. I could tell the letters a little looser, a little more effortful. But it was still unmistakably Dorothy. Still direct. Still without preamble. She began, "Ray, I know you waited to open this. That is very like you. You have always believed that the right time for difficult things is just a little further ahead. I want you to know that is one of the things I have loved most about you, and also one of the things that has occasionally driven me absolutely crazy." I laughed out loud at that. Alone in my office in the quiet of a December afternoon, I laughed the way you laugh when someone who is gone says something so exactly themselves that for 1 second the distance collapses. She continued, "I am not going to tell you what to do with the money. You already know what to do. You have known your whole life how to take care of things. What I want to tell you is something else. Ray, you spent your whole life driving other people where they needed to go. You showed up before sunrise. You kept the schedule. You got everyone there safely and on time. And then you came home and you did the same thing for Garrett. You drove him too every day to the place he needed to be. You gave him the route. You kept him safe. I want you to know that I see that. I want you to know that I have always seen it. And I want you to know that the money is not a reward, and it is not a burden. It is a door. What is on the other side of it is entirely up to you. One more thing. If the time has come for you to read this letter, then something has probably happened that hurt you. I know you. I know you will want to be fair. I know you will give people more chances than they deserve because that is who you are, and I would not change it. But Ray, do not confuse being generous with being a fool. There is a difference between a door that is open and a door that has been taken off its hinges. You are allowed to decide who walks through yours. I love you. I have always been proud to be your sister even when you drove me crazy, which was often. Dorothy. I folded the letter along its original creases. I held it in both hands for a moment. Outside the office window, the December afternoon light was thin and pale over the rooftops of my neighborhood. A dog was barking somewhere down the street. A child was riding a bicycle on the sidewalk across the way, wobbling slightly, finding the balance. I put the letter back in its envelope. I put the envelope in the breast pocket of my shirt close to my chest, where I could feel it. I was still sitting there when I heard the knock at the front door. 3 quick raps. Not Frank's knock. Frank's was rhythmic, always the same. This was more tentative. I knew it. I opened the door. Garrett stood on the porch alone. He was not wearing his jacket, even though the December air was cold, and his arms were crossed against his chest. And he looked like a man who had driven around for 2 hours trying to decide whether to come back, and had finally decided, and was now standing here not entirely sure what to do next. "Can I come in?" he said. I looked at my son. He had Carol's eyes wet at the corners. He had my jaw set the way it gets when a Callaway is trying to hold something together. He was 36 years old, and he looked about 12, standing on my porch in the cold without his jacket. "Come in," I said. "I'll get you a coat." He stepped inside. I went to the hall closet and got the old flannel-lined jacket I kept there and handed it to him, and he put it on without saying anything. And for a moment it was as if no time had passed at all, and he was a boy in my hallway getting ready to go out into the cold, and I was his father making sure he was warm enough before he went. We sat in the living room. He looked at the coffee table where Patricia's documents had been that morning. He looked at his hands. Dad, he said. His voice cracked on the word. He stopped. He pressed his fist against his mouth and breathed through his nose and tried again. "I don't know how to say what I need to say." "Then start anywhere," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." Garrett and I talked until the sun went down. He sat in the armchair across from me, and he talked the way people talk. When they have been holding something in for a long time, and have finally found the moment to let it out, not smoothly, not in order, circling back and correcting himself and stopping to breathe. He talked about Diane, about how the pressure had built gradually, how she had framed every conversation about Ray's finances as concern, as practicality, as love. He talked about the investment deal with Tyler Marsh, and how he had known somewhere underneath the wanting that it was not a good idea, but that wanting had been louder than knowing for a long time. He talked about the morning of the welfare check. He said that when he was standing on my porch, and I looked at him and he looked away, something happened in his chest that he did not have a word for. He pressed his fist against his knee when he said it. His voice was unsteady, and he did not try to make it steady. I listened. I did not interrupt. I did not tell him it was all right, because it was not all right, and we both knew that, and I had lived long enough to understand that the kindest thing you can sometimes do for a person is refuse to let them off the hook before they have fully felt the weight of what they have done. When he finished, the room was dark, and I got up and turned on the lamp and sat back down. "Shai, I heard you," I said. "And I want you to know that. But Garrett hearing you is not the same as us being where we were. Do you understand the difference?" He looked at the floor. "Yes," he said. "Good." I leaned forward. "I'm not asking you to leave your wife. I'm not telling you what to do with your marriage. That is yours to figure out. But I need you to understand something clearly." I waited until he looked up. What happened in this house over the past year was not a misunderstanding. It was a series of choices, and choices have to be answered for. Not with words, with time, with different behavior. Do you understand me?" "Yes," he said. His voice was very quiet. Then go home," I said, "and come back when you're ready to show me, not tell me." He stood up. He took off the flannel jacket and folded it carefully over the arm of the chair, the way I had taught him to fold things when he was small. He walked to the front door. He stopped and turned back and looked at me from across the room. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry. Not for anything specific. Just, I'm sorry." The whole weight of it in 2 words. "I know you are," I said. "Good night, Garrett." He went out into the December dark, and I sat alone in my living room for a long time. January came cold and clear. I made my decisions quietly, the way I had made every important decision in my life, without announcing them, without asking permission, without waiting for someone else to tell me what was right. I called Patricia the first week of January and told her what I wanted to do. She listened without interrupting, asked 3 precise questions, and then said she would have the documentation ready within 2 weeks. Patricia was one of those rare professionals who understood that their job was to make your intentions legally real, not to have opinions about them. I established the Dorothy Reed Callaway Foundation. Its purpose was straightforward financial support for Sacramento Regional Transit bus drivers facing economic hardship and academic scholarships for children from low-income families in the Sacramento area. I funded it with a significant portion of the trust assets. Not all of it, Dorothy had told me. The money was a door, not a directive, and I intended to use it accordingly. But enough to make the foundation real and lasting and worthy of her name. Frank came with me to the old depot on Richards Boulevard the afternoon I went to tell my former colleagues about the foundation. I had called ahead, and a dozen retired drivers were there, men and women I had worked beside for decades, people who knew what it meant to get up before sunrise and keep a schedule and bring strangers safely through a city that did not always notice you were there. I told them what Dorothy had done. I told them what I was doing with it. Big Harold Watkins, who had driven Route 15 for 26 years and had hands the size of dinner plates, sat in the front row and cried without making any attempt to hide it, which made me feel like I had gotten something right. Frank drove us home afterward. He was quiet for most of the drive. The comfortable quiet of a man who has witnessed something that does not need commentary. When he pulled up in front of my house, he sat for a moment with the engine idling. "Dorothy would have liked that," he said. "I think so," I said. A week later, I heard from an acquaintance that Tyler Marsh had mentioned to someone at a networking event that Garrett Callaway was, quote, waiting on an inheritance from his old man. When that reached Frank, and Frank told me, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee, and I thought about it for a moment, and then I picked up the phone and called Patricia. "The foundation documentation," I said. "I want to make sure the public summary is clear about the allocation of assets." "No, of course," Patricia said. "Shall I make sure it is filed with the county records?" "Please," I said. The following week, in the third week of March, I went to the mailbox on a Tuesday morning and found a plain white envelope with Garrett's handwriting on the front. No return address. Just my name and my street address, written by hand, in the deliberate, careful print I had taught him to use for formal correspondence when he was 8 years old. I stood at the mailbox holding it. The morning was cool and bright, the kind of California morning that reminds you why people come here from everywhere else. A mockingbird was going through its full repertoire in the oak tree at the corner. 2 houses down, someone was backing a car out of a driveway with the particular careful slowness of a new driver. I put the envelope in my shirt pocket beside Dorothy's letter, which I had been carrying every day since I read it. I was not ready to open it yet, but I kept it. I opened Garrett's letter on a Sunday morning in March. I made coffee first. I used the old drip machine, the one from the hardware store, the one I had never seen a reason to replace. I sat down at the kitchen table in the chair that faced the east window, my chair, the one that gave me what Carol used to call my best thinking light, and I set the envelope in front of me and looked at it for a moment before I picked it up. His handwriting on the front was careful and deliberate, the way it gets when he is writing something that matters to him. When Garrett was 8 years old, I had sat beside him at this same table and shown him how to write a proper thank you note. Hold the pen lightly, take your time, make each letter the same size as the one before it. He had practiced for 45 minutes without complaining, which was unusual for him at 8, and I had thought at the time that it was a good sign, that he understood some things were worth the effort of doing correctly. I opened the envelope, 2 pages handwritten, no heading, no date. He began, Dad, I have started this letter 7 times. This is the version I am actually going to send, because it is the most honest, which means it is also the hardest. I am not going to ask you to forgive me. I do not think forgiveness is something you ask for. I think it is something you earn slowly over time through being different than you were. You told me that. You told me to come back when I was ready to show you, not tell you. I am not there yet. But I wanted you to know that I am trying. I want to tell you about a memory that has been coming back to me. It was Christmas Eve the year I was 11. You worked a double shift that day, I remember, because you left before I woke up, and you came home after I was supposed to be asleep. But I was not asleep, because I had been waiting. I heard the front door, and I heard you in the kitchen, and I came downstairs, and you were still in your uniform, and you were so tired I could see it in the way you were standing. But when you saw me on the stairs, you smiled like it was the best thing that had happened to you all day. And maybe it was. You said, "Hey, buddy, you should be in bed." And I said, "I know. I just wanted to make sure you got home." And you said, "I always get home." I had not thought about that night in years. I do not know why it came back to me now. But I think I know what it means. I think it means that you were always coming home and I stopped being there to notice. I am not going to make promises. You would not believe them, and you would be right not to. But I am here. And I am going to keep being here. That is all I have right now. I hope it is a beginning. Your son, Garrett. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it along its creases and put it in the envelope and held the envelope in both hands for a moment. I thought about a boy on the stairs at midnight in his pajamas, saying he just wanted to make sure I got home. I thought about the particular weight of being needed by someone in that way, not for what you have, not for what you can provide, but simply for the fact of your presence. The fact that you came through the door. I put Garrett's letter in my shirt pocket beside Dorothy's. 2 envelopes over my heart. 2 different kinds of love, both of them real. June came warm and bright, the way Sacramento Junes come when the valley has finally decided that winter was long enough and it is time to get on with things. I drove out to the old depot on Richards Boulevard on a Tuesday morning with Frank. We brought coffee in a thermos, and we sat on the bench outside the supervisor's office where we had eaten lunch 100 times over the years. And we watched the buses pull in and pull out with the steady, purposeful rhythm of a system that does not stop for anything. Frank poured the coffee. He handed me a cup. He looked out at the buses. "You think Garrett will come around," he said. "I don't know," I said. "That's up to him." Frank nodded. "And if he does, then I'll be here." I held my cup in both hands, the same way I've always been here. Frank was quiet for a moment. A Route 30 bus pulled in the same number I had driven for most of my career. The driver was a young woman I did not recognize, and she brought the bus in smoothly, reading the curb the way good drivers read it, with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who has found the work that suits them. She killed the engine and stepped down and walked inside, and the bus sat there in the morning light, patient and still. "Dorothy was right," Frank said. "About which part?" "All of it." He took a sip of his coffee. "She always was." I drove home an hour later with the windows down. The June air came through the cab of my old truck, smelling like cut grass and warm asphalt, and the particular Sacramento summer that I had been breathing my whole life. I had lived in this city for 67 years. I had driven its streets before sunrise and after dark, in fog and in heat, in the years when everything was going right, and in the years when everything was not. I knew this city the way you know a person you have loved for a long time, not perfectly, not without frustration, but deeply in the bones. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off. The house looked exactly as it always had. 28 years of looking exactly as it had. The front porch where I had stood on a December morning and faced down whatever that morning had brought. The east window where the light came through in the early hours. The back steps dry now in the June warmth where a wet November morning had sent me to the hospital, and where I had come back and kept going. I got out of the truck. I stood in my driveway in the California morning. I put my hand in my shirt pocket and felt the two envelopes there, one from my sister and one from my son, both of them folded and worn at the creases from being carried. I did not hide the money to see if they needed it. I hid it to see if they still needed me. But she had also left me something she probably did not know she was leaving, the answer to a question I had been carrying since the day she called me on a Tuesday evening in August and told me she was dying. The answer was this: the people who matter are not the ones who show up when there is something to gain. They are the ones who show up when there is nothing left to take. Frank had shown up with lasagna and with beer and with coffee in a thermos and with silence when silence was what was needed. Margot had shown up with cornbread made from Carol's recipe, and Garrett, slowly, imperfectly still finding his way back, was trying to show up too. Dorothy had been right. It was a door, and I finally got to choose where I was going. I went inside. I put the coffee on. Outside the kitchen window, the June morning was doing what June mornings do in Sacramento, getting on with it, warmly and without apology. That was enough. That was more than enough. There is one thing I want to leave with you before I go. I spent too long believing that love was enough, that showing up every day would protect me from what I did not want to see. It did not. And if there is one thing I wish someone had told me earlier, it is this: do not wait for the moment of crisis to have the honest conversations. Have them now, while there is still time, while there is still something left to protect. I am not a perfect man. I made my own mistakes in this family story. I stayed quiet too long. I gave too many second chances. I confused patience with wisdom. Do not be like me in those ways. Be smarter. Be clearer. Say the hard thing before the hard thing says itself. Thank God genuinely for the people who show up when there is nothing in it for them. those are the ones worth holding on to. These grandpa stories are not just about old men and money. They are about what we owe each other. That is the only family story worth telling. That is the only kind of grandpa stories that changes anything. If something here touched you, share it with someone who needs it. Leave a comment. Subscribe so we can keep telling these stories together. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means everything. And one small note. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements created purely for storytelling and educational purposes. If that is not what you are looking for, I respect that completely. Please feel free to find content that serves you better. For everyone else, I will see you in the next one.